to you, unless one is born anew, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. The wind blows where it wills, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know whence it comes or whither it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. John 3. Foxes have holes, and birds of air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Matthew 8. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Matthew 13. That which I had to say about the operation of soul is completed. From the Emerald Table. So here we come again, friends. Letter 12, The Hanged Man, from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. And you'll notice that the first two epigraphs that he uses in this chapter, we've already seen as epigraphs. The first showed up in letter 1 on the Magician, and the second showed up in letter 9 on the Hermit. Now, is he running out of material? No, I don't think he is. I think what Tomberg is doing is he's performing, I don't mean that in a negative way, but he's helping us to experience the performative action of returning in a spiral fashion, right? The open circle. Returning to something we've already learned, but now we have other knowledge or deeper knowledge, perhaps, and that we can take this in a different way now, or in a deeper way, which is his project entirely. And unlike kind of traditional esoteric interpretations of this tarot card, the Hanged Man, Tomberg isn't worried about suspension, like, being hung up. Tomberg's concern here is that the Hanged Man represents someone whose center of gravity has changed, whose will has been transformed such that it is now the connection to God that it is primary, rather than the relationship to the horizontal realm of the serpent. Right? So he talks about gravitation. And he says, what is the phenomenon of religion if not the manifestation of spiritual gravitation towards God? Right? It is significant that the term the fall is borrowed from the domain of gravitation. I mean, the fall is one of his main themes here. Also, how do we respond to these two sources of orientation, to the vertical and to the horizontal? What's our relationship to it? Interesting, though, and I'm surprised you didn't mention this, but in medieval times and before, the word that they used for gravity, which they did not use the word gravity, they used the word love, because love is the law of attraction, right? It's what draws bodies together. And there was that line from St. Augustine, love calls us to the things of this world, which Richard Wilbur wrote a beautiful poem on. That's another way to think about gravity, and not gravitation towards, even you could say towards the world, but certainly towards God. If the God becomes your center of gravity, So, and of course, look at the Hanged Man. I mean, to our perspective, he's topsy-turvy, because the wisdom of God is foolishness to this world, right? And the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. So you're living in a different plane of existence if you're living like that. So you can tell also, he's concerned with where our center of gravity is, which leads him into considerations of ecstasy and ecstasy. And of course, we talked about that in letter 6 on the lovers. And he revisits a lot of things in this card. It's interesting. He also revisits the I am sayings from St. John's Gospel, which we talked about in letter 9 as well. And but he revisits them there. It's a very different letter in that regard. It's a little, in a way, easier to get through, even though it's 30 some pages long. It seems like it's not as densely packed as some of the other letters. Now he's talking about, and I also mentioned it earlier, as far as center of gravitation, talks about Peter walking on the water toward Jesus, right? And when he's walking, when his center of gravity is the Lord, he doesn't falter. But when he doubts, his center of gravity, what goes up must go down, and he's going down. Right? And of course, as I mentioned before, Tomberg says, he emphasizes, though, why were you afraid? Right? Which we talked about doubt being one of the first steps in the scientific method, which is also the realm of the serpent, right? Why did you doubt? Why were you afraid? But he asks a special question. Now, he talks about Peter, and Peter's center of gravity was outside of himself. It was in Christ. So it's kind of an ecstatic gesture. And he asks, well, where was Jesus' center of gravity? In God? Jesus is God. So what he says is Jesus Christ walked on the water not by the virtue of ecstasy, by going out of his humanity, but rather by virtue of ecstasy, centering in himself, which is the active virtue of the formula I am. Do not be afraid. So here we revisit ecstasy and ecstasy, which gives us a lot to think about. The ecstatic method for human beings. I used the example of George Herbert. There are other, this centering in oneself and meeting God there, in a kind of sober approach. And if you think about Christ on the water, it's very sober activity, right? Where Peter, who loses, he forgets that he could fall, forgets that we're not supposed to walk on water. He just sees the Lord and gets going. That's ecstatic. It's the moment we let go of what we've been taught, of rationality, of what we thought was possible, and just live out of pure moment. Right? But then he gets into these interesting vignettes, I guess we could call them, of people who levitate. Let's explore the phenomenology of levitation. And he points to saints who have levitated. St. Teresa of Avila is one. He doesn't get too much into it, but he gives a list of them at the bottom of page 312 of all these saints who had levitated in their ecstatic adoration of God. But he doesn't actually. One of my favorite stories of St. Teresa levitating is she was ashamed of herself. She was embarrassed. She didn't want to draw attention to herself in the monastery when she would start levitating at prayer. So she would ask the other sisters to sit on her. Sit on me, please. Don't let me go up this time. It didn't work. She would still go up. So why are those saints levitating? Well, he says because their center of gravity, and they've lost control. And he has an example from St. Teresa, where they've lost their like Peter, they've lost their sense of what's appropriate or of what is possible, and with their even if they're just a fleeting devotion to the Lord, they are drawn toward Him, right? But then he juxtaposes this with this example that he gives on pages 312 and 313, and he blocks it off. He has it as a block quote, but it's obviously from his experience. Sometime when he talks about this middle-aged gentleman, he was an American, who said he could levitate, and he and Tomberg go into this car on the train by themselves, and the guy lies down and focuses his energy and starts levitating a couple inches off the couch on which he was lying. And I love this part on page 313. This demonstration, having evoked in his interlocutor only a profound disgust, the anonymous master of levitation left the compartment before long and did not show himself again. And Tomberg has a thing with occult show-offs. And here's another example of a Me Too moment, and it's not it happened to me. It means look what I can do. It's like a little kid. Hey, Dad, look at what I can do. I can jump over a bush. And here are these occultists showing off again. And Tomberg points out that when these occultists do these kinds of tricks, that they often come away exhausted or, out of it a little bit. Whereas the saints, when they levitate, in adoration of the Holy Sacrament or in prayer, come back rejuvenated, right? And he talks about 3 categories of levitation, which I think are interesting. There's the rapture due to celestial gravitation, which is St. Joseph of Cupertino, St. Teresa, I think St. John of the Cross did it as well. And, is being drawn to God. Then there's levitation due to a current of human electricity emitted willfully, which he calls arbitrary magic, or involuntarily, right? So the arbitrary magic. So that was the guy on the train. That's what he was doing. It was his own will. And then there's involuntary mediumistic levitation, you could say, with table tapping and that kind of business. And he, of course, gives the example of Simon the magician, Simon Magus. And he attributes that kind of levitation to the 4-petaled lotus. Right? The Kundalini gets released. And if you've ever read anything about that, it's nothing I would ever try to do, but apparently it's a really dangerous thing to do. People go crazy from releasing the Kundalini. A friend of mine claims that this happened, and he has had health problems and mental problems, so, with anxiety and stuff like that. So that is not something I would recommend to anybody. So that's a danger, right? So if you do that, you're taking things into your own hands, and it's no longer like sacred magic. If we had examples of ceremonial magic versus personal magic versus sacred magic. Sacred magic, you can't ever go wrong with that one because it comes from above. Similar to this kind of levitation, it has a celestial center, or God is the center. You can't ever go wrong with that. Because you can't will it. You are taken up. And there's another type of the involuntarily, with the mediumistic levitation. But he doesn't even talk about a 4th kind of levitation, which is I would call diabolical levitation. And there are lots of documented proofs of people in states of demonic possession who levitate or do bizarre things. Like there was one a couple years ago, maybe 5 years ago now, in Indiana of all places, where there was a demonic presence in a house, and recorded. Actually, they took one of the kids became possessed, a little 10-year-old, and they took him to the hospital. And he walked backwards up the wall at the hospital, and you better believe all the nurses like, I gotta go. They all checked out. But it was documented in the medical record about what this boy did. So there's that kind of levitation too, which I'm surprised he doesn't get into here. Pardon me. And he says, but concerning these kinds of levitation, the law of terrestrial gravitation, this is page 314, evolution and earthly life in general is enfoldment. That is, the coagulation of mental, psychic, and physical stuff around relative centers of gravitation, such as the earth, the nation, the individual, and the organism, whilst the law of celestial gravitation, evolution, and spiritual life in general, is radiation. With enfoldment and radiation again. The extension of mental, psychic, and physical stuff rising up to an absolute center of gravitation. And this is where his quote from Matthew comes in handy. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Right? So this is important to think about this. And then he hits us with another warning about occultists. Page 315. May occultists, esotericists, and hermeticists take account of this state of things. And may they understand that the only side they can take without betraying the soul of the Hermetic tradition is that of ranging themselves resolutely and without reserve on the side of radiation. That is, to take the side of the righteous man, the hanged man. May they abandon the dream and phantoms having to do with the Superman, which still haunts certain esoteric fraternities and societies, either in the guise of a grand master, or a great initiate, or an archmage. May our communities become those of people who learn from everyone instead of teaching everyone. May they recruit people who live in consciousness of having behaved wrongly towards God, neighbor, in the world, rather than those who think they are on the right. In a word, may they be subject to celestial attraction, which acts in awakening the inclination towards the love for poverty, obedience, and chastity. Right? This is important. So how do you do this? How do you avoid becoming the great man? Well, I would suggest through regular reception of the sacraments, including confession. Because, it's like he says right here, may they recruit people who live in consciousness of having behaved wrongly towards God, neighbor, and the world. That's humility. And you can't, of course, even with these things, you can fake it, right? But how do you act with humility toward God, your neighbor, and the world? Because you have wronged them. Because we have. There's no one who doesn't sin. Even inadvertently, when you pump gas into your car, do a rickshaw of that gas getting to your tank, and how much blood is on your hands. Or when you're wearing anything. Can you buy anything that hasn't been totally fabricated in a sweatshop? I'm using an iPhone to record this. There's blood on my hands. There's some kid in Singapore, who made how much a day. It's horrible. Just can you avoid it? Can you avoid it? Right? We can never light enough candles, never say enough prayers. Right? It's like the Jains who pray repeatedly in case they step on an ant. You can't avoid, guilt in a way. And we have to remember that, because we can't, this inflation that happens, not just with occultists, but with all kinds of people, that's such a danger, and it's so harmful in the long run. And he continues in his discussion, thinking about the reorganization of our thought, feeling, and will when it comes to this figure of the hanged man. Because for most people, he says, we think first, feel, then make a decision. Whereas the hanged man, just the opposite. He doesn't have time to think about. He almost acts instinctively toward God. That's a way to put it, I guess. So it's the will goes straight there. His will, because not my will, but thine be done. Right. That kind of union of the will, and then it hits feeling, and then you understand it afterwards, which is one of the things that Tom Berg's interested in. Right. And this is the spiritual man, he says. The Superman does it the other way around, but the spiritual man has a center of gravity there and acts out of that. So he acts automatically, in a way, for the good. And he says on page 317, so the will is an active force. It is not naturally an organ of perception. In order for it to be able to perceive, it must not become passive, for then it would fall asleep and fade away, because its very nature is activity. And in ceasing to be active, it would cease to be will. No, it should change center of gravitation, that is, transform my will into thy will. It is the inner act of love alone which can accomplish the change of center that the will uses, or around which it gravitates. Instead of gravitating around the center me, it can orientate itself towards the center you. The transformation effected by love is what one calls obedience. Right? So there come the vows again. It is through obedience that the will is able to perceive. Right? And he talks about Abraham's call, where God says, go do this. Abraham gets up. I think another example of this would be St. Joseph, who doesn't say one word in the Bible. All he does is act. When the angel appears to him and says, get up, take the child and go into Egypt, St. Joseph doesn't say, why? He doesn't even say, well, can I go next week? I've got all that stuff I got to clean. He gets up and he goes. That's acting straight from the will. I mean, you could say St. Joseph is really this spiritual man. Because think about it. You think about his role in human history. He gets up and he acts. Doesn't ask any questions. And even at the Annunciation, right? Can you imagine? Can you imagine? The angel appears to him and says, guess what your new job is? He doesn't say, but you got to be crazy. What? Right? Which is what happens with St. Joachim, right? He debates the angel and he's struck dumb until John is named. John the Baptist is named. But not so with Joseph. So I think that might be a good example. And Joachim is still a saint. He didn't do anything that I wouldn't have done. Not at all. But there's a difference between his response and St. Joseph's response to the angel's proclamation. Let's think about that. Now, another thing Tomberg brings up is in this, what he would call practical hermeticism, is how it can contribute to Christian mysticism. So these kind of practical stages he's giving us, especially through in practical hermeticism he talks about it's bottom of page 319. Practical hermeticism applies itself to educating thought and imagination to keep in step with the will, because unlike mysticism, like St. Joseph of Cupertino, who has that his will is activated even more than his emotion and thought. But Hermeticism, you try to keep all three at the same time. Right? It has the aspiration to keep the other two powers company. Right? And this is what he says about this. This is the principal point of practical Hermeticism, and at the same time, its contribution to Christian mysticism. This is page 320. I say Christian mysticism and not Christian mystical theology, because theology rationalizes the material of mystical experience in deriving rules and laws, whilst Hermeticism wants thought and imagination to participate in this experience. Its aim is found in the experience itself, not in the domain of explaining it or accounting for it. And this, as I've mentioned, this is what I call, I think it's connected to what I call poetic metaphysics, right? Where it's not about the explanation, it's about the immediate perception, and this is why I think phenomenology is such a valuable tool, because you get away from the conceptual, from the dialectical approach that plagues our. It shouldn't plague. It's just a feature of our society, but we do it automatically. But to venture into a poetic perception based on a phenomenological disclosure or epoche, then this has harmony with what Tomberg is describing as practical hermeticism, because we rely or reside in the experience and not in the concept. And that's the danger with theology. Is theology, has a structure, has an edifice by which we try to make things fit. It's in Aristotle, it's the organon, right? The organon is a kind of a file cabinet. It's a system of organization. And so if in a theological context, a heavy scholastic theological context, someone has an experience and we try to correlate this experience with whatever box that happens to be, which Hermeticism isn't trying to do that. Hermeticism isn't interested in the conceptual as much as in the experience, and seeing how that experience enlivens our thinking, feeling, and will. That way to put it. So and so Tomberg continues though with his thoughts about formal theology. Now, of course, not all formal theology, but tendency of theologians, let's put it that way, to do something that's not very cool. And he says on page 320, authentic Hermeticism can therefore never be in contradiction with authentic faith. It can contradict only the opinions of theologians. That is not the faith, but the confidence that is born towards the statements of theologians. The strange thing is that theologians are, as a rule, very modest and even humble people. But from the moment that they sit in the chair of their science and drape themselves with the mantle of its primary and secondary conclusions, and above all, the general consensus, they change and are no longer recognizable. And this is what happened to Father Sergei Bulgakov. He ran up against the consensus of the fathers, or at least what we think the consensus of the fathers was, and he got in all kinds of trouble for his sophiology. Not that it mattered to him, because he held to what he thought was true, to what he knew was true. And to this day, the Eastern Orthodox debate the value of his sophiology, though they value his theology pretty highly. So go figure. And Tomberg goes on, he said, this is because their science, theologians, is the most pretentious of all sciences that exist, being interpretive of the absolute truth of revelation. In contrast, the representatives of the natural sciences are, as a rule, very pretentious people, but the discipline of their science renders them modest. He said something nice about science. And this is a problem. This is a problem, And what I think the problem certainly isn't theology. It's what Carl Jung would call persona. And I think this also stumbles upon, we're going to talk about it in a couple letters, but we talked about it a little bit already, the egregore, right? The stereotype, or else the group soul that says you have to behave a certain way or think a certain way, or be ostracized from the group, or scapegoated. That's what I think is going on too, and in theology. So when Carl Jung talks about the persona, it's precisely, but who, you ever see the movie? What's it called? Ghostbusters. It's probably not the place you expected to hear a Ghostbusters reference, But there's a really funny scene where Bill Murray is investigating some psychic phenomena, and his character is talking to this woman, and he says to her, "Are you on drugs?" I can't remember the character's name. "Are you on drugs?" "No." "Have you been smoking or taking alcohol?" "No." "Are you menstruating?" And then another character says, "What's that got to do with it?" And Murray says, "Back off, man. I'm a scientist." So you get a lot of this "back off, man. I'm a theologian," or whatever profession. You get it from doctors, from physicians. You get it from professors. You get it from mechanics. You get it from anybody. That's the persona speaking. Back off, man. Right? And then he gives this dreadful example, and it's a good example of a dreadful thing on page 321 from Cardinal Louis Bilot, who tells you what happens to the soul at death. And Tomberg lets him have it with both barrels. And he calls them undoubtedly monstrous conclusions, because it is impossible to believe simultaneously Cardinal Bilot's statement and that of the gospel, which says, if a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 and go in search of the one? What? And he says, one is bound to believe either that the mercy of God is limited, that is, that it extends only to the instant of bodily death, or that it is infinite and never ceases. Again, we get to apocalyptasis, right? You know, and how could Cardinal Bilot have it? How could you know? I mean, this is or anybody, any theological statement, and this is the problem with scholasticism, is that it would say, make statements like this about when the soul leaves the body. You know, it's like, is it a contest? Is it a race? And if you don't repent before death, you're game over? God, is that punitive? I can't believe it is. I can't believe that's how it is. And I think also when this is the big critique of the theology of the real presence of the transubstantiation, you know. And this is why I think the Orthodox have a leg up on Western right Catholicism, because with the doctrine of transubstantiation, you know, it gets scientific. Let's get scientific about theology. And in the Orthodox interpretation of it's the body and blood of Christ. It's a mystery. We don't know how. We know that the boss said that's what happens, and that's what happens. He said, "This is my body." We don't need to get scholastic about it. And that's the big criticism of the Orthodox have of transubstantiation. It's like a needless scientific intervention, which might startle some, but I think there's much to that. I mean, it complicated things that didn't need to be complicated. And in fact, you know, in Latin Catholic circles, you know, they make a big deal about the words of institution, right? This is my body. That's the moment that the transubstantiation happens. But there's also, in the Eastern liturgy, there's the words of institution, and there's the epiclesis, where it's the calling down of the Holy Spirit to transform the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ. And that happens after the words of institution. So complicates things, right? And in the Coptic Church, which the Catholic Church approves as a valid liturgy and a valid Eucharist, they don't even have the words of institution. So this kind of scholastic obsession with scientific definitions and rubrics kind of undermines itself, I think, ultimately. And he continues to talk about he talks about three things: the zodiacalization of the will, the solarization of thought, and the selenization or lunarization of imagination. Right? And as you'll see, this becomes another meditation on the three vows. Right. We have chosen these three terms to signify the voluntary sacrifice of the soul's powers to heaven. It means to say that the will becomes an organ of perception and execution towards God, as the zodiac is in the macrocosm. That thought becomes warm, both warm and luminous, as the sun is in the macrocosm. That lastly, the imagination becomes reflecting towards truth, as the moon is towards the sun in the macrocosm. It is a matter, therefore, of sacrificing the three powers of soul to heaven. The sacrifice is nothing other than the three traditional and universal vows: that of obedience, or the sacrifice of the will; that of poverty, or the sacrifice of thought; and that of chastity, or the sacrifice of imagination. It is thus that the will, thought, and imagination become reflectors of the revelation from above, instead of being instruments of human arbitrariness. And this is what he sees in the hangman, right? And you can think about the hangman as not I, but Christ in me, right? And because he's surrendered to God in a way, he surrendered his will, and so becomes a vessel of sacred magic. And then in a letter that is replete with revisiting of elements from earlier letters, he revisits the lotus flowers, or the chakras. And in talking about these three sacrifices, the will, feeling, and thought to heaven. And he thinks, in terms of esoteric psychophysiology, that the disposition of the crown center, which is always beyond the reach of human arbitrariness, and which is constantly in a state of divine repose, which is always at the disposal of heaven, extends to the other centers or lotuses. All right, so he's saying the crown center, which is outside of the body, it's kind of the higher self, you could say, that all the centers then become crown centers in a way. Now, remember earlier, he talked about all the centers becoming hearts. So this is Christian yoga again, right? They become organs of pure revelation, he says. And this is the hangman is emblematic of this. And he says the degree of saintliness, from the point of view of human psychophysiological organization, the degrees of saintliness depend on how many and which centers are at the disposal of heaven. That's interesting. And he's got another one of his anecdotes about a friend who lost the use of his center of intellectual initiative, his third eye, and he had to get it back somehow. He doesn't tell how it came back, but I wish he would. And then there's another one where he talks about someone who had been in the White Army, and he doesn't tell the whole story, and I'm kind of wondering why he put it up there if it just didn't finish, and the book went to publication after he died without him being able to edit that. But he does say, with these kinds of troubles, and I think of my friend who had trouble with Kundalini, I would recommend people, this is page 325, who have had similar or identical difficulties to address themselves to the Holy Archangel Michael, who is, it seems to me, a very special friend and protector of the kind of hermeticists that I have in view in these letters. That is, people who want to unite saintliness and initiation, or who aspire to a hermeticism that is holy and blessed from above. And I do have to say, recently on Michaelmas, we had Eastern Vespers in our barn, as part of our Michaelmas festival, and I had never attended Vespers for Michaelmas in the Eastern Church before, and I was kind of blown away. I was the reader for this, and it was one powerful and intense prayer service. And I've been to Vespers many times, but never this Vespers. But this, it was intense, and you could really feel the presence of Saint Michael there. And he was calling, and he, as we say, he don't play. That's one serious angel. But I think Tom was on to something. I think the Michaelic presence is important for the Hermetic path, because, this is a path fraught with temptations to megalomania, and you better believe that the hierarchy of the left will be happy to make you look like a fool just about any opportunity. So Saint Michael, the archistrategist, right, is the one, to keep close. Have an icon of Saint Michael someplace, or a statue. It's a good thing. All right. And so when he talks about, and this is interesting too, I think, on page 325, he's talking about the two trees that act as pillars, and that from which the hangman hangs. And he notices that there are 12 branches that have been cut off. And for Tomberg, this means the zodiac has been internalized into the hangman, or the hermeticist, we should say, at this stage of, we could say, initiation. And he points out, he does some numerology. He said, for 12 is the number of modalities of the will and its action. 7 is the number of basic modalities of feeling and imagination. 3 is the numerical law of thought and word. And 1, lastly, is the number of the self, who thinks, feels, and wills. The monad, therefore, reveals itself through the trinity underlying thought and word, through the septenary underlying feeling and imagination, and through the duodenary underlying will and action. The sum of the numbers of reality, 1, 3, 7, and 12, is 22, which is important also in the Kabbalah, the 22 paths in the Kabbalah, 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And it's also important in music, in Pythagoras. So in music, if you're not familiar, 3 is, most chords are composed, the simplest chords are composed of three notes. But 7, there are 7 notes in a scale, and the octave is the 8th note, and they're all half tones as well. And there are 12 tones in a scale. So, when we talked earlier about the music of the spheres, so if you're musical, this is kind of an interesting thing to think about. If you ever get a chance to study the monochord, the last words of Pythagoras are reportedly, study the monochord. Because studying those intervals is kind of revelation of cosmic harmonies as well. At least that's according to Pythagoras. And actually, also according to Robert Flood, the Rosicrucian and Paracelsus physician from the 17th century. If you ever see his illustrations of his books, he often has images of a monochord, because he corresponds the monochord and the intervals to the planets and to the human body, and it's pretty profoundly interesting to me. And I think Robert Flood is, I probably said before, kind of unsung hero in Western esotericism. And it's too bad, because he's very little read, because all of his books, except for one, are in Latin, and they're huge. So they're a real task to translate them into other languages, and there's probably not a huge market for them. And his one book, The Mosaical Philosophy, I don't think it's ever been published in a modern edition, though it'd be easy to do. Surprisingly, it hasn't been. But to continue, we'll just he talks about clairvoyance, and this is around page 331. And he says, reasoning is not the only method of knowledge. There are also so-called occult or supernormal methods of knowledge. I have in mind the diverse forms of clairvoyance: corporeal, psychic, and spiritual. What is the relationship, therefore, between authentic faith and the experience of clairvoyance? Now remember, he started talking about levitation earlier, and now he's talking about clairvoyance. And there's a relationship. And he says, and then it is necessary to say, first of all, that the whole domain of supersensory experience is divided into two intrinsically different parts, namely into that of perception of what is outside of the soul and that of revelation of what is above the soul. The latter is transsubjective, and the former is extrasubjective or objective. St. Teresa called them imaginary vision and intellectual vision. And I won't read the examples from St. Teresa. But one is when St. Teresa has a sense that Christ is near her, and he speaks to her, but she doesn't see anything, not with her physical eyes, and not with what she calls the eyes of the soul, in a kind of imaginative vision. And as Tomberg says, the eyes of the soul of which St. Teresa speaks are what we call in modern Hermeticism the lotus flowers, or simply lotuses, and what Hindu yoga names chakra centers or chakras. And then he does an interesting thing here. He says the higher lotuses, the 8-petaled, 2-petaled, and 16-petaled, which is this one, and this one, are organs which are made use of by the Spirit. And in the case of revelation from above, such as in the case of St. Teresa, intellectual vision. Okay? So when St. Teresa sees or perceives that Christ is near her, it's out of those centers, he's saying. Okay? The crown, the third eye, and the throat. Then he goes, the lower lotuses, the 10, 6, and 4-petaled, are the organs of horizontal perception, or of St. Teresa imaginary vision, where she actually sees him. She sees his hands, and then she sees his face, and she sees all of him. Right? Concerning the heart, which didn't get mentioned, which is the 12-petaled lotus, it participates in the two kinds of vision, or if you wish, it possesses a third kind of clairvoyant perception, which is the synthesis of the other two. For the heart is the center or lotus of love, where, truth to tell, it is no longer a question of above or outside, or even of above and below, because love abolishes all distances and all distinctions of space, even distinctions of spiritual space. It has the power to make all things present. It is thus that God is present in a heart glowing with love. The heart perceives diverse presences as impressions and nuances of spiritual warmth. Right? So, in a way, you could have thought earlier in this letter when he was talking about the centers being transformed into crown centers, that, well, didn't he just say that the centers were actually supposed to be transformed into heart centers? Well, he's saying that in a different way now. Because if we transform the centers into crown centers, they're all centers of revelation then. But that does not supersede the importance of the heart as the center of warmth, which is central to the Hermetic path. And he says, page 335, dear unknown friend, be attentive to your heart and towards the nuances of intimate warmth which arise from its depths. Who knows who may go on his way with you without your eyes and your understandings surmising it. Right? And then he talks about another kind of, there are illusory hallucinations and revelatory hallucinations. All depends on what the soul exteriorizes through the channels of corporeal senses, right? And which can be dangerous. And he doesn't like Martin Luther too much. He talks about Martin Luther's experience of throwing an ink pot at the devil. And he said, well, how can you do that? There are two different planes of existence. And he says, no, just as there is hysteria due to illusion and hysteria based on truth, as for example in the case of stigmatas and wounds from the crown of thorns, which manifest themselves in the bodies of people who have had spiritual experience of the Lord's passion, so also there are illusory hallucinations due to fears or immoderate desires, and revelatory hallucinations that is, hallucinations of the truth. Crazy people conceive it. They, wonderful discussion with a priest one time about Joan of Arc, because I was kind of troubled with Joan of Arc. Like, does God really tell people to go to war? I mean, I couldn't figure it out. He said, well, I said, what if she was crazy? And he said the greatest thing. He said, what makes you think God doesn't speak to crazy people? And there have been actually some interesting, and not lately, but I think in the 80s and 90s, there were some interesting studies done by psychologists of mental patients, who, there were, I guess, two kinds, like two categories, you could say, of mental patients who said they experienced God. There was the mental patient who experienced God, and their behavior became peaceful, they became kind and generous. And there's other kind of mental patient who said they experienced God, who became kind of like our occultist megalomaniacs. They became, crazy. I mean, just dangerous. So, you can think of St. Francis. St. Francis apparently underwent some PTSD, which resulted in his religious conversion, right? So, and if you read the Flowers of St. Francis, there are reasons to believe, well, the boy was a little touched. But, he was touched for Jesus, in a sense. And to get away from clairvoyance, he says, look, clairvoyant or not, all empirical experience is necessarily hypothetical. It is only authentic faith which has absolute certainty. So you could think you could have had visions. You could think you had visions. You have significant dreams. Yeah. Those things really don't matter compared to authentic faith. And that's what. And he says on page 337, do not scorn anything and reject anything if you have authentic faith. It is this and this alone which renders everything truly useful and which gives them value, which they would not have without it. And then he kind of ends this chapter, or this letter, with a curveball. So he's been talking about the hanged man, this person with his center on God, this kind of this stage on the hermetic path that you could say could lead to clairvoyance and a kind of different I guess manifestation of sacred magic. But then who does he compare the hanged man to in the last analysis? Job. The hanged man is the eternal Job, tried and tested from century to century, who represents humanity towards God and God towards humanity. Whoa, where did that come from? The hanged man is the representative of humanity, who is found between two kingdoms, that of this world and that of heaven. Now it's interesting that he uses the term representative of humanity. Now I haven't read French, so I don't know if that's what he used in French, but that's the term that Rudolf Steiner uses in his famous sculpture. The representative of man is between Lucifer and Ahriman. But here, Tomberg, I think it may be a critique of Rudolf Steiner, says the hanged man is the representative of humanity who is found between two kingdoms, that of this world and that of heaven. That's different than Ahriman and Lucifer, though some people might interpret it that way. And this is probably a fundamental place where Tomberg differs from Steiner. And as we'll see later, is a big critique about Ahriman and Lucifer coming up, and not about the application of those ideas, I guess we could say. But he's hung between this world and that of heaven, which we all are, and as we've been talking, that's we can't escape the realm of the serpent, the horizontal layer, but we can make ourselves available to grace. And that's probably the achievement of Job and the achievement of the hangman, is they ultimately, despite trouble, are open to grace. And may we all be open to grace. Till I see you again.